The sun was setting as Dr. Thomas Allen pulled his car into the driveway of his home. The golden light caught on the windows of the two-story house he and his wife had bought just 3 months ago. It was their dream home in a nice neighborhood, the Yao kind of place where they wanted to raise their kids. Thomas cut the engine and sat for a moment, letting the quiet wash over him. His shoulders slumped with exhaustion. It had been one of those days at Memorial Hospital. Thomas had been on his feet for 12 straight hours in the trauma center. As a surgeon, he was used to long shifts, but today had pushed him to his limits. 3 critical patients had come through his operating room: a teenager who'd been in a motorcycle crash, an elderly man with severe internal bleeding, and a little girl, no more than 7 years old, who'd been in a terrible car accident. The little girl's face kept floating back into his mind. Her parents had hugged him so tightly when he'd told them she would make it. Those were the moments that made the job worth it. Thomas reached for his bag in the passenger seat. His blue scrubs were hidden under a gray hoodie he'd thrown on because the hospital air conditioning was always too cold. He'd been so busy he hadn't had time to change before heading home. All he wanted now was a hot shower, a warm meal, and to hug his wife and kids. As he stepped out of his car, Thomas noticed a few unfamiliar vehicles parked across the street. The Henderson family, 2 doors down, often had guests over, so he didn't think much of it. He locked his car and walked toward his front door, fishing his keys from his pocket. The neighborhood was quiet except for the distant sound of someone mowing their lawn and kids playing somewhere down the block. What Thomas couldn't know, was that eyes were watching him from behind curtains in the house across the street. His neighbor, a man he'd never met despite living there for 3 months, was on the phone with emergency services. "Yes, there's a suspicious man in a dark hoodie who just pulled into the driveway at 1487 Oakwood Drive," the man was saying, his voice tense with worry. "I don't recognize him. I think he might be breaking in." "Can you describe what you're seeing?" asked the dispatcher. "He's a black man, maybe in his 30s, wearing a hoodie. He's trying to get into the house now. I don't think he lives here. The family that moved in is never home at this hour." The neighbor had never actually met the Allens. He'd seen Thomas's wife and kids coming and going during the day, but Thomas usually left for work before dawn and often returned after dark. The neighbor had made assumptions based on nothing but his own prejudice. "Is he carrying anything that looks like a weapon?" the dispatcher asked. "I don't know. Maybe. He's got something in his hand. Please hurry." The something was just Thomas's house keys, but the call had already set wheels in motion. The dispatcher, hearing the panic in the caller's voice and following protocol for a potential home invasion, elevated the response level. The address was entered into the system and units were dispatched immediately. Inside his house, Thomas dropped his keys on the small table by the door. The house was quiet. His wife Lisa had texted earlier that she was taking the kids to her sister's place for dinner and would be home around 8. Thomas had 2 blessed hours of peace ahead of him. He kicked off his shoes and padded to the kitchen in his socks, opening the refrigerator to grab a bottle of water. He didn't hear the vehicles arriving outside. 3 police cars and a SWAT van pulled onto his street, lights off, approaching silently. The officers had been briefed about a potential break-in situation with a possibly armed suspect. They took positions around the house, weapons ready. Thomas was just about to head upstairs for that shower when the sound of heavy boots on his porch stopped him cold. Before he could react, a commanding voice boomed through a megaphone from outside. "This is the police. Come out with your hands up." Thomas froze, the bottle of water slipping from his fingers and hitting the floor with a thud. Water splashed over his socks, but he barely noticed. His mind raced to make sense of what was happening. Police? At his house? There had to be some mistake. He moved cautiously toward the front window and peeked through the curtains. What he saw made his blood run cold. Police officers were positioned all around his yard, crouched behind their vehicles. The last rays of sunlight glinted off their weapons, all pointed at his house. "This is the police," the voice came again. "We have the house surrounded. Come out with your hands visible." Thomas's heart pounded against his ribs. In all his years as a trauma surgeon, he'd seen countless victims of violence come through his doors. He'd patched up gunshot wounds and stab wounds. He'd saved police officers and criminals alike. But he'd never imagined he would find himself on this side of a police confrontation. His first thought was of his family. Thank God Lisa and the kids weren't home. His second thought was that he needed to stay calm. As a surgeon, he knew how to keep his head in crisis situations. He took a deep breath and moved toward the door, raising his hands before he even opened it. "I'm coming out," he called. "Don't shoot. This is my house." With steady hands that had performed countless delicate surgeries, Thomas reached for the doorknob. He had no idea that his life was about to change forever, all because of a neighbor who had never bothered to meet the family who moved in 3 months ago and had seen only the color of his skin. Thomas slowly opened his front door, his hands raised high above his head. The moment he stepped onto his own porch, he was blinded by the harsh glare of tactical flashlights aimed directly at his face. He squinted against the light, barely able to make out the silhouettes of officers positioned across his front yard. The peaceful neighborhood he'd chosen for his family had transformed into something out of a nightmare. "Get on the ground. Now." The command came from an officer standing behind the open door of a police car. His voice was sharp with authority that left no room for questions. "This is my house," Thomas tried to explain, his voice steady, despite the fear gripping his chest. "I live here. There's been a mistake." I said, "Get on the ground." The officer's voice rose. "Hands behind your head. Do it now." Thomas knew enough about these situations to understand that arguing would only make things worse. With his heart hammering against his ribs, he slowly lowered himself to his knees, then lay face down on the concrete of his own driveway. The rough surface scraped against his cheek. Just hours ago, his hands had been steady enough to repair a child's damaged artery. Now those same hands were trembling as he placed them behind his head. He could hear boots approaching, heavy on the pavement. Someone grabbed his wrists roughly, pulling them behind his back. The cold metal of handcuffs bit into his skin as they clicked shut. Too tight. But Thomas didn't protest. A knee pressed into his back, holding him down with unnecessary force that pushed the air from his lungs. "What's your name?" demanded a voice above him. "Dr. Thomas Allen," he managed to say, his face still pressed against the concrete. "I'm a trauma surgeon at Memorial Hospital. This is my home. My ID is in my back pocket." "Yeah, right," muttered another officer. "We'll see about that." Thomas felt hands patting him down, checking for weapons. They found nothing but his wallet, phone, and the hospital access card clipped to his scrubs under his hoodie. By now, porch lights were coming on up and down the street. Neighbors Thomas barely knew were stepping outside, watching the scene unfold. Some had their phones out recording everything. He could hear their whispers, see their faces when he managed to turn his head slightly. This humiliation was happening in front of everyone, on the front lawn of the home he'd worked so hard to buy. One of the officers, an older man with a crew cut and hard eyes, flipped through Thomas's wallet. "Says here your address is 1487. Oakwood Drive," he admitted, his tone still suspicious. "That's right," Thomas said. "This is 1487 Oakwood. This is my house. I just got home from work." The officer holding Thomas down leaned closer. "These people always cause trouble," he said, just loud enough for Thomas to hear, but too quiet for anyone else or the neighbors' recording phones to pick up. The words stung worse than the handcuffs or the concrete against his face. "Check his ID badge," said a younger officer who was standing back a bit. He sounded uncertain, like he was beginning to realize something wasn't right. The crew-cut officer examined the hospital ID that had been clipped inside Thomas's hoodie. "Memorial Hospital," he read aloud. "Dr. Thomas Allen Trauma Surgery." "I told you," Thomas said, trying to keep the anger from his voice. "I just finished a 12-hour shift. I saved 3 lives today. I'm not a criminal. I live here." From the corner of his eye, Thomas could see a man standing in front of the house across the street. The man was shifting uncomfortably from foot to foot, looking like he wanted to disappear. Thomas had never spoken to him, but he suspected this was the neighbor who had called the police. "Hey," a woman's voice cut through the tension. Thomas recognized it immediately. His stomach dropped. Lisa, his wife, was rushing toward the scene, her face twisted with fear and anger. She must have come home early from her sister's house. What are you doing to my husband? Lisa shouted, trying to push past an officer who blocked her path. That's my husband. This is our house. Ma'am, stay back, the officer warned her, holding up a hand. Don't tell me to stay back. What is wrong with you people? That's my husband. He's a doctor. The officers exchanged glances. Doubt was beginning to creep into their expressions, but the one with his knee on Thomas's back didn't let up the pressure. We received a call about a break-in at this address, the lead officer explained to Lisa, his voice slightly less certain now. A break-in? He lives here. We've lived here for 3 months. Lisa was nearly screaming now, tears streaming down her face. Look at him. He's wearing hospital scrubs under that hoodie. He just got off work. Thomas turned his face toward the GI officer who was reading his ID. My wife is right. Please just check my driver's license against the property records. This is our home. The younger officer stepped forward. Sir, I think we should verify the property ownership. The lead officer nodded reluctantly. Keep him secured, he ordered, then stepped away to speak into his radio. The pressure on Thomas's back eased slightly, but the handcuffs remained tight around his wrists. He could feel blood trickling where they had cut into his skin. More neighbors had gathered now, their expressions a mix of shock, curiosity, and in some cases, a satisfaction that made Thomas's stomach turn. He'd always wondered how some of his neighbors felt about a black family moving onto their street. Now he knew. The crew-cut officer crouched down near Thomas's head. If this turns out to be your house, you can file a complaint tomorrow. But right now, you're going to stay exactly where you are until we sort this out. Understand? Thomas nodded slightly, the concrete scraping his face again. He understood perfectly. Even if this was all cleared up in the next 5 minutes, the damage was already done. His neighbors had seen him handcuffed and pinned to the ground like a criminal. His wife was in tears, and something had broken inside him, a trust, a belief that working hard and saving lives and buying a nice house in a good neighborhood would somehow protect him from moments exactly like this one. The lead officer returned, speaking in hushed tones with the others. Thomas couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could sense a shift in the atmosphere. Something was about to change, but he didn't know if it would be for better or worse. Thomas remained on the ground, feeling every tiny piece of gravel digging into his cheek. The murmur of voices around him seemed distant, like he was underwater. He kept his eyes on Lisa, who was still arguing with an officer at the edge of their lawn. Her voice had gone hoarse from shouting. Thomas wanted to tell her it was okay, to calm down before things got worse, but he couldn't find his voice. A young officer knelt beside him, leaning in close. Sir, we're verifying your information right now. Try to stay calm. Thomas gave a tiny nod. The officer seemed different from the others, less harsh, more uncertain. He had kind eyes that didn't quite match his tough uniform. I understand this is difficult, the young officer continued quietly. But we need to follow protocol until everything checks out. I get it, Thomas finally managed to say. I've worked with police before, at the hospital. The young officer looked at Thomas's hospital ID badge again, studying it more carefully this time. You're a trauma surgeon? 12 years now, Thomas replied. His heart rate was finally slowing down a bit. Something about this officer's tone made him feel like maybe things would work out. I was on shift all day today. The officer nodded and stood up, walking over to speak with the others. Thomas couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could see the doubt spreading across their faces as they looked at their phones, presumably confirming his identity and address. Lisa had stopped yelling and was now speaking rapidly to an officer, showing him something on her phone, probably photos of their family in the house, Thomas guessed. Their teenage son Ryan was standing by their car now, looking terrified. Thomas hadn't even noticed him arrive with Lisa. The sight of his son watching him handcuffed on the ground filled Thomas with a burning mix of shame and anger. No father should have to be seen like this by his child. The lead officer, a tall man with broad shoulders and a stern face, approached Thomas again. His expression had shifted from aggressive certainty to something more complex. "We've confirmed this is your residence, Dr. Allen," he said, his voice formal. "We're going to remove the handcuffs now. Please understand we were responding to a report of a break-in." Thomas said nothing as the crew-cut officer roughly removed the handcuffs. He sat up slowly, rubbing his wrists where the metal had cut into his skin. His scrubs were dirty now, smeared with dust and bits of gravel. The blue fabric that had been clean at the hospital was now stained with sweat and grime. "You can file a complaint if you feel that's necessary," the lead officer added, holding out a hand as if to help Thomas up. Thomas ignored the offered hand and stood on his own. His legs felt shaky, but he forced himself to stand tall. "Who called this in?" he asked, his voice even. The officers exchanged looks, but no one answered. Thomas turned toward the house across the street, where the same neighbor still stood watching, though now he seemed to be trying to blend into the shadows of his own porch. "Was it him?" Thomas asked. Again, no answer. But the officer's eyes flickered toward the man across the street, confirming Thomas's suspicion. Lisa rushed to Thomas's side, throwing her arms around him. "Are you okay? Did they hurt you?" She was crying, her whole body shaking with anger and relief. "I'm okay," Thomas said, though he wasn't sure if that was true. His body might be unharmed, but something inside him felt broken. Ryan approached. Cautiously, his teenage swagger gone, replaced by a vulnerability that broke Thomas's heart. "Dad?" he said softly. Thomas pulled his son into the hug, closing his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, he saw that most of the officers were retreating to their vehicles. The show was over. The excitement had died down. Just a misunderstanding. They'd tell everyone. Nothing to see here. The young officer who had shown him kindness lingered, looking genuinely troubled. He stepped closer to Thomas and his family. "Sir, I want to apologize personally," he said quietly. "This shouldn't have happened this way." Thomas studied the young man's face. He was probably newer to the force, not yet hardened by years of seeing the worst of humanity like the others. There was still hope for him. "What's your name, officer?" Thomas asked. "Officer Chen, sir. Michael Chen." Thomas nodded. "Thank you, Officer Chen." The moment was interrupted by the arrival of a more senior officer who had been talking on his radio. His uniform had more badges and stripes than the others. He approached with the stiff formality of someone preparing to deliver an official statement. "Dr. Allen, I'm Captain Rick Taylor," he said. "I understand there's been an unfortunate misunderstanding here tonight." "Is that what you call it?" Lisa snapped before Thomas could respond. "An unfortunate misunderstanding?" The captain's expression remained carefully neutral. "Ma'am, we responded to a call about a possible break-in at this address. We followed standard protocol. You put my husband in handcuffs on our own driveway." Lisa was trembling with anger. "In front of our neighbors. In front of our son." Thomas put a steady hand on Lisa's arm. "Let me handle this," he said gently. To the captain, he said, "I understand you were responding to a call. What I don't understand is why I was immediately treated as a threat instead of as the homeowner." The captain looked uncomfortable. "We take all potential home invasion calls seriously, sir." The caller reported seeing someone they didn't recognize entering the house. "Someone they didn't recognize," Thomas repeated. "I've lived here for 3 months. I'm the homeowner, but I was someone they didn't recognize." An uncomfortable silence fell over the group. Even the few remaining officers seemed to shift uneasily. "Your department has my information now," Thomas continued. "My name, my occupation, the fact that I live here. I hope that means next time my neighbor calls because he sees a black man entering my own home, you'll check your records first." Captain Taylor cleared his throat. "Dr. Allen, if you'd like to file a formal complaint, that is certainly your right. We can—" He was interrupted by a commotion as one of the officers who had been clearing the scene suddenly collapsed on the lawn. It happened so fast, one moment he was walking toward his vehicle, the next he was on the ground clutching his chest. "Officer down," someone shouted. Thomas's training kicked in automatically. Without thinking, he rushed to the fallen officer's side, all thoughts of his own humiliation forgotten in an instant. "Give me space," he ordered, kneeling beside the man. It was the crew cut officer who had tightened his handcuffs and whispered, "That comment about these people." The man's face was now gray, his breathing labored. Thomas checked his pulse, rapid and irregular. He recognized the signs immediately. "He's having a heart attack," Thomas called out. "I need a first aid kit." "Now!" Officer Chen sprinted to his patrol car and returned with a medical kit. Thomas ripped it open, finding basic supplies. Not enough, but it would have to do until the ambulance arrived. "Has someone called 911? Thomas asked, his voice now carrying all the authority of the trauma surgeon he was. "Already done," Captain Taylor confirmed, watching with wide eyes as Thomas began administering emergency care to the officer who, just minutes before, had treated him like a criminal. The fallen officer's eyes focused on Thomas, a flicker of recognition and confusion crossing his pained face. The fallen officer's eyes were wide with fear and pain as he looked up at Thomas. His breathing was becoming more labored by the second. Thomas could see the man was struggling to process what was happening, how the person he'd just helped humiliate was now fighting to save his life. "I need everyone to step back and give us air," Thomas ordered, his voice carrying the same authority it did in the emergency room. The police officers immediately created space around them. Even Captain Taylor took a step back, recognizing the shift in command. Thomas leaned in close to the officer whose name tag read, Brooks. "Officer Brooks, I'm Dr. Allen. You're having a cardiac event. I'm going to help you, but I need you to try to stay calm. Can you do that for me?" Brooks managed a small nod, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. "Good. Now tell me, do you have any history of heart problems? Any medications you take?" Brooks shook his head, then winced in pain. "No. History," he gasped. Never he had problems before. Thomas checked his pulse again, still irregular and now weaker. He turned to Officer Chen. "In your first aid kit, do you have aspirin?" Chen nodded and quickly produced a small packet. Thomas took it and turned back to Brooks. "I need you to chew this aspirin. Don't swallow it whole. Chew it. It will help thin your blood." With shaking hands, Brooks took the aspirin and did as instructed. Thomas continued his assessment, his hands moving with practiced precision despite the bizarre circumstances. Just 30 minutes ago, this man had been pressing a knee into his back. Now Thomas was all that stood between him and death. "How far out is the ambulance?" Thomas asked, not looking up from his patient. 4 minutes, someone replied. Thomas nodded. "Officer Brooks, the pain, is it radiating down your left arm or up into your jaw?" "Arm and jaw," Brooks confirmed, his voice barely above a whisper now. "Can't breathe right." Lisa had moved closer, standing just behind Thomas. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. It was a small gesture, but Thomas felt its meaning. Despite everything that had happened, despite the humiliation and anger they'd just experienced, she was supporting his decision to help. "Ryan," Thomas called to his son without turning around. "Go inside and get my medical bag from the hall closet, the black one with the red cross on it." Ryan sprinted toward the house, grateful to have something to do besides watch the chaos unfold. Thomas turned to Captain Taylor. "I need you to make sure the ambulance knows they're coming for a middle-aged male with a suspected myocardial infarction, a heart attack. Tell them I'm a trauma surgeon on scene performing initial treatment." The captain nodded and spoke urgently into his radio. Ryan returned with the medical bag. Thomas quickly unzipped it and pulled out a stethoscope and blood pressure cuff. As he listened to Brooks's heart, his face grew more serious. "His blood pressure is dangerously low," Thomas announced to the officers gathered around. "And I'm hearing abnormal heart sounds." From his bag, Thomas produced a small case containing emergency medications he kept for house calls to elderly patients in his neighborhood. He found what he was looking for, a small vial and syringe. "This is nitroglycerin," he explained to Brooks, who was looking more terrified by the second. "It will help dilate your blood vessels and ease the strain on your heart until the ambulance arrives." As Thomas administered the medication, Brooks grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. Their eyes met, and for a moment something passed between them. An understanding, perhaps, or at least a recognition. Why? Brooks began, struggling to form the words. Why are you helping me? After what I said? After what we did? The gathered crowd fell silent. Even the night seemed to hold its breath as everyone waited for Thomas's answer. Thomas continued working as he spoke, his hands never stopping their careful assessment and treatment. Because that's what I do. That's who I am. His voice was steady, calm in the face of chaos. I took an oath to preserve life. All life. Brooks's eyes filled with tears, whether from pain or emotion it was impossible to tell. The sound of sirens grew louder, cutting through the night air. Relief washed over Thomas's face as the ambulance turned onto their street, lights flashing. Within moments, paramedics were rushing across the lawn with their equipment. Thomas stood to brief them, speaking in quick, precise medical terminology. The paramedics nodded, clearly recognizing that they were dealing with a fellow medical professional. They worked efficiently to stabilize Brooks and prepare him for transport. As they loaded Brooks onto the stretcher, he reached out a hand toward Thomas. "Doctor," he called weakly. Thomas stepped closer to the stretcher. "Yes?" Brooks looked up at him, his face pale but his eyes clear. "Thank you," he said simply. Then, after a pause that seemed to stretch forever, he added 5 words that nobody expected. "I was wrong about you." The gathered police officers shifted uncomfortably. Some looked at the ground, others exchanged glances. Thomas simply nodded, acknowledging what must have cost Brooks considerable pride to admit. "Take good care of him," Thomas told the paramedics as they lifted the stretcher. "We will, Doctor," one assured him. "Thanks to you, he's got a fighting chance." As the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle pulled away, Thomas became aware of the eyes on him. The neighbors still watching from their porches, the remaining police officers, his wife and son standing nearby, and Captain Taylor, whose expression had completely transformed. For a long moment no one spoke. The night air was heavy with unspoken thoughts and shifting perspectives. Thomas stood tall in his dirty scrubs, somehow looking more dignified than anyone else present despite the ordeal he'd just been through. Captain Taylor approached him slowly. "Dr. Allen," he began, sounding genuinely humbled. "What you just did? I don't have words." "I don't need words, Captain," Thomas replied. "What I need is for this never to happen again, not to me, not to anyone else who happens to be black in this neighborhood." The captain nodded solemnly. "I understand, and I can promise you that we'll be implementing changes in how we respond to these types of calls." Officer Chen stepped forward. "Dr. Allen, is there anything we can do for you right now?" Thomas looked at his family, Lisa with tear tracks, still visible on her cheeks, Ryan looking at him with a mixture of fear and newfound respect, then back at the officers. "Yes," he said finally, "I think there is something you can do." A week had passed since that night on Thomas's front lawn. The story had spread through the neighborhood, then the local news, and finally made its way to national headlines. Doctor saves officer after racial profiling incident. The video taken by neighbors had gone viral, showing Thomas handcuffed, on the ground, then rising to save Officer Brooks's life. Thomas sat in his living room staring out the window at the reporters who still occasionally parked across the street, hoping for a follow-up interview. He had turned down most requests, preferring to let his actions speak for themselves. But today was different. Today he was expecting visitors. Lisa brought him a cup of coffee, setting it on the table beside him. "Are you sure about this?" she asked softly. "You don't owe them anything." Thomas took her hand and squeezed it gently. "I'm not doing it for them," he said. "I'm doing it for us, for Ryan, for the next family that moves into this neighborhood." The doorbell rang. Ryan, who had been hovering nervously in the hallway, called out, "They're here, Dad." Thomas stood, straightening his shirt. Unlike that night, he wasn't wearing scrubs or a hoodie today. He was dressed simply in a button-down shirt and slacks. He wanted them to see him as he was, not just a doctor, not just a black man, but Thomas Allen, a human being deserving of the same respect as anyone else. He opened the door to find Captain Taylor standing there, along with Officer Chen and, to his surprise, the police chief herself, a stern-looking woman with silver hair and tired eyes that had seen too much. "Dr. Allen," Captain Taylor greeted him formally. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us." Thomas nodded and stepped aside to let them in. Lisa and Ryan joined him in the living room, sitting close beside him on the couch as the officers took seats across from them. The police chief leaned forward, her hands clasped together. "Dr. Allen, I want to start by offering my deepest apologies for what happened to you and your family. There is no excuse for how you were treated." Thomas recognized the carefully rehearsed nature of her words but appreciated them nonetheless. "Thank you, Chief Williams. I accept your apology." Chief Williams continued, "We've reviewed the body camera footage and the neighbor's call. The responding officers failed to follow proper protocol in several key ways." "And Officer Brooks?" Thomas asked. "How is he doing?" A flicker of surprise crossed the chief's face as if she hadn't expected that to be his first question. "He's recovering well. The doctors say if you hadn't acted so quickly, he might not have made it. He's asked to speak with you when he's released from the hospital." Thomas nodded, taking this in. "I'd be willing to meet with him." Officer Chen, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "Dr. Allen, what you did that night, it's changed things at the station. People are talking about it. Really talking, you know." Lisa shifted beside Thomas. "Talking is fine," she said, her voice controlled but tight with lingering anger. "But what's actually going to change? My husband and son shouldn't have to live in fear in their own neighborhood." The chief straightened her back. "Mrs. Allen, that's partly why we're here today. Captain Taylor, please explain the changes we're implementing." Captain Taylor cleared his throat. "First, we've placed the crew cut officer who made the inappropriate comment on administrative leave pending a full investigation. Second, we're revising our training protocols for responding to these types of calls. Third, we're implementing a community engagement program to ensure officers know the residents they serve." He reached into a folder and pulled out some papers. "We'd like you to consider being part of that program, Dr. Allen. Your perspective would be invaluable." Thomas took the papers but set them aside without looking at them. "I appreciate the gesture, Captain, but I have some conditions of my own." The room grew still. Even Ryan, who had been fidgeting nervously, sat up straighter. "I want to meet with my neighbor, the one who called 911, Thomas said firmly. "Not for an apology, but for a conversation. I want him to see me as a person, not just a threat walking down the street." The officers exchanged glances. "We can arrange that," the chief said finally. "And," Thomas continued, "I want to start a program at the hospital for first responders, not just dealing with emergencies, but understanding biases in medical care. Officer Brooks's heart attack might have been prevented with better preventative care. Many people in our community don't get the care they need because of preconceived notions." The chief nodded slowly. "That sounds like a valuable initiative." "There's one more thing," Thomas said, his voice growing softer. He turned to Ryan, who was watching him with wide eyes. "My son asked me why I helped Officer Brooks after what happened. I told him that changing hearts and minds sometimes requires more than just words. It requires action. Sometimes it requires forgiveness." The room was silent as his words sank in. Officer Chen looked down at his hands. Captain Taylor's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. Even the stoic chief seemed moved. "So here's what I propose," Thomas continued. "Instead of filing a formal complaint or lawsuit, which I have every right to do, I want to work with your department to create real change. Not just policy changes that look good on paper, but meaningful connection between officers and the communities they serve." He stood up and everyone else rose with him. "What happened to me that night was terrifying and humiliating. But what happened afterward showed me something important. That change is possible, even in the most unlikely moments." 3 months later, Thomas stood at a podium in the community center. The room was packed. Police officers, medical staff, and community members all gathered together. In the front row sat Lisa and Ryan, along with Officer Chen and, remarkably, Officer Brooks, who had made a full recovery. "Today we launched the Bridge program," Thomas announced to the crowd. a partnership between Memorial Hospital and our police department to improve care, communication, and understanding in our community. He gestured to Officer Brooks, who stood up with some effort and joined him at the podium. "I never thought I'd be standing here," Brooks admitted to the crowd. "That night I saw Dr. Allen as a threat, not as the man who would save my life minutes later. I was wrong, and I'm grateful for the chance to make it right." Thomas placed a hand on Brooks's shoulder. "We all have biases," he told the audience. "The question is what we do when we recognize them. Do we defend them or do we work to overcome them?" From the back of the room, Thomas spotted his neighbor, the one who had called 911 that night. They had met several times since then, awkward conversations that had slowly evolved into genuine dialogue. The man gave a small nod of acknowledgement, which Thomas returned. After the ceremony, as people mingled and chatted, a young black boy approached Thomas. "Dr. Allen," the child said hesitantly, "my mom says I should thank you for what you did." Thomas crouched down to the boy's level. "What's your name?" "David," the boy replied. "I want to be a doctor too someday." Thomas smiled, seeing a reflection of his younger self in the boy's eager eyes. "You know what, David? The world needs more healers, and not just in hospitals." As Thomas watched David run back to his mother, he felt Lisa's arm slip around his waist. "You okay?" she asked softly. Thomas nodded, watching as Officer Brooks chatted with Ryan about his upcoming basketball game. "Yeah," he said. "For the first time in a long time, I think we all might be." What had begun with humiliation had transformed into something unexpected, a bridge between worlds that had seemed impossibly far apart. And it had started with 5 simple words spoken in a moment of truth. "I was wrong about you." Those words, Thomas reflected, might be the most powerful medicine of all.